All right, so the title of the talk is why OpenStack folks should care about Spinnaker. But the overall theme is a little bit broader. And the theme is basically about the importance of various open source communities that are out there working on infrastructure projects, working more collaboratively with the communities that are there working on different app tools. And in my personal belief is that this area where these two communities intersect, where the app people and the infrastructure people intersect, if we could get that part right, if we could get that collaboration right, this is what's going to unlock an order of magnitude type returns with respect to open source innovation. So I'd like to open with this. There is arguably a notion out there that the application folks and the infrastructure folks are already working very well together. After all, we have Cloud Foundry in kind of sponsoring and exhibiting in OpenStack, OpenStack exhibiting in KubeCon, all this kind of collaborative SIGs going on. But my personal observation has been different. My personal observation has been that in reality, generally, these two communities don't understand each other very well. I can share some kind of anecdotal observations. So when it comes to Spinnaker at Mirantis, we first encountered Spinnaker like a few years back. We weren't even looking anywhere in the application direction. We were deep infrastructure OpenStack guys at the time. And one of our customers said, we don't really want to use Horizon. We'll just use OpenStack API instead of Horizon. We want to do this thing called Spinnaker. And our guys just went ahead and kind of did it. I probed with the team and asked, you guys want to take a look at why does it make sense maybe? Is it interesting? So, no, it's Spinnaker is just some sort of CI/CD thing. It's like the app thing. Like, we don't care about this. We do OpenStack. Then, as we started eyeing the space a little bit closer, we started talking to our customers, and we probably spoke to 40 or so customers, primarily OpenStack customers, because that's what our customer base is, about CI/CD space and Spinnaker in general. And most of the answers we got is like that it's very similar to what we heard from our internal dev teams 2 years ago. Like, we care about infrastructure. We don't understand CI/CD. And also notably, just recently, I've been browsing through the OpenStack user survey. And I've noticed that up until recently, we've kind of had a section there that covered types of workloads and types of applications that run on OpenStack. But in the most recent edition, I didn't really find anything about that, which I don't think that maybe Foundation doesn't care about that. I think that maybe the users that are running OpenStack, at least that's what we're seeing from our experience, don't really care about the apps up above. So the reason why I picked this picture is not just because it's kind of memorable and funny, but because I think it also actually represents the root of the problem fairly well, in my view. The infrastructure folks, which is us, Mirantis, OpenStack folks, have a particular view of the application space in general. And they view the application space kind of looking up at the application from the infrastructure. Whereas the application guys are looking down at the infrastructure from the application. And those two vantage points are actually very different. And I wanted to dive into a little bit and show a little bit more as to what I mean by that. So this is pretty common type of DevOps dilemma story, where today, if you talk to most CIOs in an enterprise, they'll all tell you, yes, we are doing digital transformation, releasing software faster is the most important thing for us. But if you start digging into how the organizations are structured and how the different teams are goaled and what their KPIs are, the apps people and the infra and ops people are very different. Starting with the fact that all of the people that are building applications in the enterprise are typically reporting into line of business. There is many of them, and they're distributed. If you look at the ops and infrastructure people, it's a centralized function reporting into the CIO. Of course, app people want to release faster. Infra people want to maintain the uptime SLA and control cost, and as a derivative of that, avoid lock-in, because lock-in usually translates to cost. And finally, and probably most importantly, if you're an app guy looking down infrastructure, you want to use whatever tools and frameworks you like, and you just don't want to worry about the infrastructure. If you're an infrastructure guy looking up at the applications, you want everybody to use your infrastructure. And if you go to any enterprise, like the folks that are implementing OpenStack internally, like they're literally gold on having people use their infrastructure. So they're looking at the world through that prism. Another interesting kind of a disparity between the app world and the infrastructure world that I've observed is kind of what framework is used to look at the space and to look at the problems around the space. So at the infrastructure level, we look at the space in terms of stacks. So we have hardware, then we have our virtualization layer, then we have our OpenStack or orchestration API, and then a PaaS. And the kind of movement there is we want to move up the stack, and this is kind of where innovation is happening. In the app world, people think primarily in terms of pipelines. And the trend there is to actually do as much as possible at the early stages of the pipeline, at like the build stage. And the move up the stack in the app world is called shift left. And you can Google shift left, and you can find a bunch of stuff about what that means. It's kind of like a trend, right? So this combination of kind of vertical stack mentality among the infrastructure people and the need to get everybody to use their infrastructure usually leads to somewhat imperfect solutions by the infrastructure people to the problem of the application developers, which is to release faster and more often. And the two solutions that we saw so far is kind of PaaS and CMP, right? So PaaS is kind of a, how do I get a developer to use my infrastructure and give them the higher level services that will help them build faster. So, and we know that the first iteration of PaaS, which was largely about kind of producing a service catalog, didn't really work out very well. Like .cloud ultimately evolved and became Docker, and the whole PaaS is now kind of disaggregating and what we're referring as CaaS. CMP is a slightly different cloud management platform, if some of you are not familiar. It's kind of a similar concept, but different slice. It's, again, kind of an infrastructure person solution to the developer problem of, I want to use different tools and I want to use different type of infrastructure. So, OK, you can do it as long as you go through some sort of API that I control. And this way, I kind of mitigate login. So now, this is kind of the end of the section about the differences between the app people and the infrastructure people. Switching gears a little bit, this is like a slide from the Mirantis presentation that we've used for a long time to pitch OpenStack to kind of higher level decision maker. And the summary is, buy OpenStack, you'll be able to build software faster. Part of me always understood why this kind of approach is important, because the message of, hey, buy OpenStack, it's cheaper than VMware, is not very inspiring. You have to give like a forward-looking message. The other part of me always kind of questioned how you connect the dots there. Like, OK, OpenStack is great. You have cloud. You can get VMs faster now and containers faster. But like, how does it connect to the developer releasing software faster? So as we started probing into, what should we as a company do in the application space, we decided that we want to kind of start from scratch. And we want to forget about the fact that 95% of our business is OpenStack infrastructure. And we want to put ourselves in a developer's shoes. And we want to see how is it that we can actually help developer truly release faster. So we started unpacking the space. And of course, the first thing that we've come up against is this picture. We realized that this CI/CD thing that we initially thought, Spinnaker and the developer people are doing, is not just a thing, but it's actually two things. And CI and CD are two different disciplines. CI primarily has to do with taking the code and building some sort of deployable artifact, be it an AMI or a container, whereas CD has to do with actually taking that artifact and deploying it to an infrastructure target. Also, CI is a very developer-specific thing, typically attached to a developer team, whereas CD, similar to the infrastructure space in general, is actually usually a centralized function that requires orchestration of multiple roles and multiple tools. Very quickly, as we've kind of carved CD out into a separate thing and understood it, we realized that OpenStack all of a sudden is not just this cool thing that lets you get VMs faster, that it actually becomes an enabler for a much better pattern for lifecycling an application, which is the immutable infrastructure pattern. So I won't go into the details of immutable infrastructure. Most of you guys probably have heard of it, but the general idea is that you keep your configuration and keep your basically image consistent from dev to stage to production. Instead of fussing with making the best Puppet script that you can actually upgrade or change a VM in place, you just get a new VM and you spend your effort on building a deployment strategy or delivery strategy where you switch one VM for the other. And it's only possible if you have an API-driven infrastructure powered by OpenStack. So that immediately already made our story about we help you build and release applications faster much more convincing. And then taking this a little bit further, we tried to think about, is there a way to actually unify the concept of pipelines and stacks? And as we started looking at the space from kind of the developer standpoint, from the application looking down infrastructure, we realized it's not that hard. And you can think about the entire process as kind of one big flow. So you start with CI, where development teams build the deployment artifacts. Then you have your continuous delivery, which is responsible for orchestrating the many tools involved in deployment. Then you need something to actually orchestrate the virtualization layer underneath, and OpenStack does that, and it's kind of downstream from deployment. And then finally, you have your vert layer that is orchestrating the hardware. And if you zoom in on actually what OpenStack does and what Spinnaker does in this now unified flow, the roles are very similar. So if you think about why OpenStack became popular because enterprises had already invested in fairly diverse infrastructure, such as storage, network, different hypervisors, et cetera. All of these things needed to be orchestrated together for you to be able to bring up VM, wire up the network, connect storage to it. And all of these orchestration tasks is what basically OpenStack did through its architecture that is built around pluggability. And this has been my historic pitch of OpenStack, right? So you can build a cloud based on your existing infrastructure investment. Now, when it comes to actually deployment and delivery, the task is very similar. It's just that the tools are different. So Spinnaker, just like OpenStack, its core tenet is pluggability. If you look at any enterprise, there is a vast diversity of different tools that are used in the deployment process. Different teams could be using different CI servers. You have your different SecOps and compliance teams that are using different artifact scanners, et cetera. You can have different tools for actually building the images. All of these things need to be orchestrated and glued together with an API. And the notion of actually being able to do it in a uniform way is exactly why Spinnaker was built. So connecting these things together, what comes to my mind is that if we as OpenStack people are agreeing that we should be looking somewhere up the stack and this is where the innovation is, the natural extension for us to move up the stack is not paths, but really the continuous delivery space. And Spinnaker to CD is what OpenStack is to basically infrastructure orchestration. And the reason why this is all important to all of the OpenStack people, I think, is because if you look during the last 10 years, the trend for infrastructure and platform services team, and this is the last slide, has been to kind of gradually progress from 10 years ago, focusing a lot on just actually physically wiring the infrastructure and doing infrastructure maintenance, to then in the cloud age, almost becoming an internal cloud provider to the your enterprise consumers, and building OpenStack clouds and whatever other clouds you do. As we progress forward, the role moves away from actually fussing with the infrastructure layer, which becomes more and more mature and more automated, and towards helping the developers actually deliver and deploy their apps faster. And I think that the core to OpenStack as a community evolving forward is actually embracing this vision and moving in that direction. So that's all I had. Thank you.